when cultural safety was not employed in healthcare. And there are many instances, but I'm just going to talk about three today. So Brian Sinclair was an Indigenous man. Here are some examples that are very famous examples in Canada of when cultural safety was not employed in healthcare. And there are many instances, but I'm just going to talk about three today. So Brian Sinclair was an Indigenous man. He was 45 years old, and he died waiting to be seen in the emergency room at Winnipeg's Health Science Center. He was discovered dead 34 hours after he arrived. So he was sitting in his wheelchair, and people just kept walking past him. The healthcare workers just assumed, oh, he's Indigenous, he's drunk, he must be homeless, and he passed away from a very treatable. Um, he had a bladder infection, so he passed away in the emergency room, sitting in his wheelchair, ignored. A group of doctors and academics from across Canada have said Brian Sinclair is an example of a person killed as a result of racism. The same is true of a woman by the name of Joyce Equaquin. She died of something that was very treatable. As she was dying, she recorded live to Facebook some of the comments that were being made by the hospital staff, including nurses, who were saying horrible racist things about her. This was in Quebec, and she ends up passing away. And it's a little more complicated than what I'm explaining right now, but one of the things out of the inquest into her death provincially was that racism was certainly a factor in her death, and the second thing was a call for cultural safety training for healthcare staff across Canada. So the Canadian Nursing Association probably will move on this to ensure everyone has cultural safety training. Another example is a woman in Niagara here. She goes to the hospital with back pain. She sends her home and tells her to take the Tylenol. She goes back in an ambulance the next day, and she passes away when she arrives at the hospital. Again, it was an example of lack of cultural safety for a patient in a healthcare setting. So now in the Niagara Health System, if this is the system that you're going to stay and work in, they have started to take diversity, equity, and inclusion very seriously. If you interview for a job in the hospital system in Niagara, you will be asked specifically, so you may want to prepare this based on your learning in this course. What do you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion? So talk about your own experiences and why you think it might be important that a healthcare system is responding to ways that are equitable, inclusive, and culturally safe. Specifically, you can see from their annual report that they've implemented some actions as a result of their reconciliation work, but also as a result of the death of the woman in Niagara. And so they're offering Indigenous cultural sensitivity training. They're going to do a review of their emergency department to better understand the experiences of Indigenous patients. They're creating a new role for dedicated Indigenous patient navigators that are going to support Indigenous patients and families. And they've created a new role for dedicated social workers within the emergency department to support the non-medical needs of patients in the Indigenous community and other equity deserving groups. So someone comes into the emergency room and they are homeless, then this social worker can help with those non-medical needs as well. So providing a culturally safe environment practices respect for the cultural identities of other people. It meets their needs, their expectations, and their rights, and it's intentional and do no harm. Right? It is in no way decreasing the well-being of a person or causing harm or disempowering, demeaning, or diminishing a person's cultural identity. Being anti-racist also means using a trauma-informed approach. And that means that there's an event or a series of events or circumstances that are experienced by an individual as physically and or emotionally harmful and threatening, and that have lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning or physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Trauma can result from a number of things, from ACE events, abuse, neglect, poverty, assault, sexual assault, having life-threatening illnesses, going through repeated or painful medical interventions, accidents, witnessing violence, and you can see at the bottom there, intergenerational violence, like the intergenerational trauma for Indigenous people. It can also come from forced displacement or refugee status, or living in war, or grief from separation for loss. And it can also result from discrimination, racism, sexism, genderism, ableism, any of those forms of discrimination can result in trauma. And when we're working with people using a trauma-informed care, we don't say what's wrong with you. This isn't trauma therapy. Using the trauma-informed approach presumes that everyone has experienced trauma. Okay, and so it's simply asking what has happened. There are 4 R's in trauma-informed care: to realize that trauma is widespread and that there are different potential paths for recovery. Everybody should be responsible to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. Everyone should be prepared to respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma, and everyone should actively resist re-traumatizing children or adults. So how do we re-traumatize people? On the left, you see within systems, we re-traumatize people by asking people to continually retell their story. Every time a person retells a story of trauma, they're being re-traumatized. Treating people as a number. Procedures that require disrobing. You have to be very careful in how those are done, particularly, as you know, with people who've been victims of sexual assault or assault on their bodies. The disrobing can be re-traumatizing. Ensuring that people are seen as more than their label. So, not stereotyping somebody, they're an addict or they're schizophrenic. Not providing people any choice or decision making in their own service or treatment, and not giving them any opportunity to provide feedback about what their experiences was. In an individual relationship, we re-traumatize people when they're not being seen, or we don't hear them, or we don't believe them. When we violate their trust, when we don't allow them to collaborate, um, and when we use punitive treatment and oppressive language. Those are all forms of things that re-traumatize people at both the systemic and personal relationship. And we know that the effects of trauma are varied. It can impair cognitive skills. It can also be correlated with heart disease, obesity, addiction, diabetes, and cancer. Trauma impacts a person's ability to trust and cope and form healthy relationships. It disrupts emotional regulation. People then have difficulty distinguishing between what's safe and unsafe, and it influences self-concept. So the effects of trauma are pervasive. So You should now quickly review the videos that are posted in your lecture folder. You also are expected to read Chapter 6, complete the homework activities that are there on top half for you. I've also given you on Blackboard a practice test in an app called Kahoot. So you click on that link and you can practice. There are many of the same questions in the practice test that will also appear on your real test. And also remember that your second certificate assignment number 2, you watch this Ontario Human Rights e-course called Call It Out. And after you answer the questions, it will produce a certificate for you. The instructions for the certificate are there. The link to access the training is here. And then you submit your certificate, and the certificate looks like this. So no choice on the second assignment as you had on the first assignment. There's only one option to complete this certificate on race.